As we near the end of the 2025 IRFA conference, I'm very, very happy to be joined by Lee Swan of Alexforbes, because she is a specialist in an area that has been spoken about extensively over the last 2 days, and that we've been covering in a number of the interviews that we have been doing, and that is impact or sustainability or ESG. What is it? We don't know. We hear it, but what is this ultimately all about? So everyone, I'm going to use some skeptical terms on purpose, even though I am very much in favor of impact investing as a philosophy. I'm going to say there's a bandwagon, and everyone's talking about impact, and everyone suddenly is an impact investor in South Africa. Lee, perhaps you can comment on that, but also help our viewers understand a little bit around what is ESG, how has ESG evolved over time into impact, and is sustainability the same thing?
So these are all really great questions. They get asked frequently. I think we hear these terms being used interchangeably quite often. So I think that it is quite important to get a clear picture. To my mind, sustainability is really about the outcome that we're looking for. And what that is balancing out our economic needs, our social imperatives, and our relationship with the environment from a give and take perspective. And it's really the sort of action of trying to balance all of those simultaneously, or keep them in balance over time. So from a sustainability point of view, I think it's really about the outcome. ESG is a term that's been used in recent times in the capital markets. Mm-hmm. My sort of philosophy or theory on why the term was coined is, nobody needs to be told in the capital markets that we need to make returns. So the economic return bit kind of is silent. Mm-hmm. We do need to be told that we can't do it at any cost from a social and environmental perspective. And it's clear that we need to be told that we need to govern over these things properly. So it's almost identifying the blind spots from what we've experienced historically. And then impact for me is really critically where we are at now. Back to the outcomes from a sustainability perspective. Ultimately, when we look at ESG, those are effectively looking at inputs into a process. Mm-hmm. What are you taking into account and how? That's fine, and I think it is useful, but we've moved far beyond that. I think all of us know Regulation 28 had that very short couple of paragraphs in there around ESG and sustainability in the context of investing. It's been around since 2011. We're a long way away from 2011 now, but we're not seeing necessarily the impact being followed through from the intent. Mm-hmm. So it's really getting off paper, out of just policy, just process, and ticking boxes, and actually understanding, is the intention being reflected in the real world? And that for me is where we come to talk about impact. It's about the outcomes. It's not about the inputs anymore. Quite interestingly, we surveyed the audience in one of the last sessions where they were given a choice around whether ESG is dead, mm-hmm. Whether ESG is alive and kicking, and the last choice was ESG is not dead, but it's not enough. And the majority of the audience chose the last option, and I think that says it all. I think what trustees are struggling with, though, is how do you tell the difference between a story that's being told, from a policy or a process perspective, and box ticking. How do you actually tell the difference between whether that's having the intended impact or not? And I think that's really important, that trustees get to understand how to engage with the right information, ask the right questions, and skill themselves up in order to have better conversations and make better decisions on behalf of members.
So I did a course on sustainable business strategy. Right now, I've been brought up to believe it's earnings, otherwise you lose your job. Sustainable business strategy spoke about 5 pillars to running a business in a sustainable manner. The first one, yes, there's your shareholder and the earnings. There's your people, making sure that they are motivated, well looked after, and delivering. There's your customer who ultimately pays the bills and is the reason that you exist. There is your community, so that you can thrive and grow and develop your business further. And there's the regulator. And you should be implementing strategies focused on all five in order to develop your business. Now, when I look at that and having been through that process, to me, the principles behind ESG fit into that quite nicely. So they are principles that can be followed in order to have a happy, healthy environment and business that you are part of. Correct me if I'm wrong, and if you want to debate on it, but that's how I tend to view it in my mind. So when it comes back down to boards of trustees and now how do you implement that along with your consultants and so on, I see ESG principles as something that spreads across your entire investment strategy that you can utilize to monitor the outcomes that are taking place from the capital investments that you're making, and to assess the behaviors and the competencies that ultimately you have. I always said one of the best ways as a consultant to understand an investment manager is to talk to them about ESG on the businesses they're investing into, because then you're going to get a good understanding of how well they know those businesses, how much interaction they've had with management, and so on. So if you're managing your business with those principles in mind, you should have a good business at the end of the day. So that's the first thesis that I have in that regard. To me, impact is a dangerous word because it sounds fantastic on the tin. But the reality is impact is not impact unless there is an intention to deliver a specific outcome that can be measured. And that's what I fall back on when I look at that, because I do see the potential for a lot of, and I must be careful the words that I use, not so much manipulation, but more, trying to think of a good word to use. It's the only one I can come to. Correct.
Incorrect representation, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few critical things. You know, if I was engaging with a business or a fund or portfolio manager, I'd want to understand what's most materially important to the outcome that they're driving. So we'd want a good quality conversation. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all, so I wouldn't have a shopping list in my mind of specific things, but I would want to hear that they've applied their mind. I think this is one of these things. I mean, it's true for many things. There literally is no substitute for the application of mind. Mm-hmm. So it's not something where you can just subscribe to a data or a ratings agency, etc. Yep. You do have to apply your mind, and I'd want to really hear a good process and a good thought process that sits behind that, and a good defence if we want to debate it. So I think that's really important. I think from a measurable impact perspective, I think this is now where we're at, is the how. It's not about the what, it's actually not about the intentions anymore. I think it's about now the how. We are seeing a rise in litigation globally around climate change and other issues for pension funds and corporates. So I think it's something to watch. We must make sure that we're not misrepresenting, what it says on the tin. And I think that's where the effort needs to go in. Understand what's material, and then be able to figure out how to measure it in some form or another, and be able to convince yourself that the impact is actually happening on the ground. So I think critically important for trustees to get there. And we're not going to get there by only measuring inputs. It does have to actually be outputs. And I think we've been doing this for long enough, that theoretically we should be able to start to see those outputs if they're not already obviously apparent. We need to sort of pull back the veil and get to the crux of whether they're there but we can't see them, or whether they're actually not there, in which case whatever we're doing is not working. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really where the conversation needs to get to, is what do we need to change in order to have real impact, and how do we inform those conversations with proper information.
So from a South African perspective, why is impact so important in the context of our world?
Well, I think from a risk perspective, I think critically important. We've got a lot of unsolved historic issues that are playing systemic role from a risk perspective. I think that's critical. I think from an inequality perspective, really critical. I think you only need to read actually quite sort of shallow to be able to see that we're going in the wrong direction from an inequality perspective. We need to solve for that because that creates risk. So we really do need to solve for that. So I think the social impact, when I look at all of this, having spent a ton of time on the environmental side, looking at governance, looking at, the financial side of things, ultimately it all comes back to people. And we need to solve for people, the impact on people's lives. It's very pronounced in when you look at it through a retirement fund perspective, because that financial outcome is critical as a enabler for dignity in retirement at a time which you're effectively the most vulnerable in your life outside of childhood. So it's critically important, those outcomes. So it comes back to people, and we can't continue to have some people be okay and some not in our society. So we need to figure that out.
You refer to it as a risk, which I'm interested in exploring a little bit. So why have you used the word a risk? That these, be it inequality, unemployment, why is that a risk ultimately for people?
It's a good question. I think, I think the first things first is you want to cover off something that you perceive as a risk, rather than starting by solving something that might be a nice to have. So I think if there are risks presented, we need to cover those off as part of a process of avoiding losses to start with, and then finding opportunity thereafter. I think there is a lot, a lot of risk and a lot of opportunity. I think it's about understanding the full picture. I think it's also really important from an impact perspective to understand not only the positive impacts which you might be intending, but also the potential unintended impacts as well, to be able to see that spectrum. And where you start to see a shift from an impact perspective over time, either positive or negative, on different variables, you want to be inquiring as to whether that's sort of purposeful and intentional or circumstantial. Is it correlative or is it causative? And then be sort of interrogating from that perspective.
So a couple of practical examples. By the fact that there's such high levels of unemployment means that there's high levels of criminality. As a result of that, your cost of retiring is higher than what it possibly could be, because you need private security, be it guarded estates or whatever it might be. These are the cost of food might be higher, or whatever it might be as a result of these issues. So if we don't solve those issues, ultimately it just costs us more down the line. And what's the point of retiring into an environment where you can't actually live comfortably through that, or your cost of retirement is so much higher? So the two do go hand in hand and do need to be solved for it. My question to you would be, what's government doing? Why doesn't government do this? Surely it's government's job.
I'm going to leave that one for you to ask someone from government. But what we are seeing is movement on the regulatory front. And we're seeing a fair amount of movement in different areas, but I think one that's quite important to understand is around sustainability-related disclosures. It's a conversation that's happening globally. It is also happening locally. We've already seen the FSCA say that they're going to introduce mandatory disclosures for some regulated entities, starting with large listed companies initially, around climate change first, and then broader-based sustainability, and linking to the IRFA, International Sustainability Standards Board's standards. So, really relying on that kind of global standard as the regulated framework to disclose against. So I think something important to consider. Also, it's already in the FSCA communication that they'll then be turning their attention to pension funds. So I think it is something that's really important. It's not something that's far out in your investable universe. It's there, yes, really important, probably helpful if we get it right in our context and don't just take a blanket approach based on what other jurisdictions have done. And then there's also a national policy conversation happening around sustainability disclosures. Again, I think helpful from a decision-making perspective, and especially over time. So you're going to start to get a sense of, whether the story is the same year on year and it's never progressing, which could be an example of greenwashing, not getting great information, no progress, despite intent, etc. But I think it'll deliver better information, potentially more comparable information for decision-making, which I think will be useful. So things to watch out for. in our local context at both a FSCA level but also at a national government level around some of these things.
So that'll definitely drive action and adoption, but I think there's also an awareness that needs to be created around the fact that we've come from a past that is not just a normal correction that needs to take place. It's going to take time and it requires capital, and that's why government, you can argue about whether they're doing the job well or not. It's irrelevant. There's not sufficient capital in the government coffers to be able to correct this. The private capital is so big that ultimately they are the ones that also need to come to the fore and not see it as it's a charitable effort. It's ultimately it's part of solving for the member picture that is required within the particular circumstances of South Africa. And a lot of people say to me, this is more about social issues we need to solve for. And I don't really believe in that. I mean, if there's significant climate change events that take place, this ultimately costs our economy as well, and it impacts the member at the end of the day. So private capital has not so much a responsibility, but should have a want to solve for these issues.
Yeah, I think it'll be a combination of public and private sector, possibly policy, regulation, and then I guess free market, PPPs, etc. I think there's a role for all to play, but we're not going to get there. We're not going to get all the way there without private capital being injected. I guess it's managing that kind of risk return impact. And making sure that we're structuring the way forward in a way that each of those critical participants can enter into these investments or asset classes at a risk appetite that suits firstly their mandate, but also makes good common sense.
Okay, so you represent Alexforbes here. Alexforbes are a significant player in the retirement industry. What is it that you guys are doing to progress this mandate that you have?
Yeah, so we're doing a lot at a sort of systems-based level, really engaging with regulators, policymakers, to make sure that as mandatory reporting or any other regulation is brought in South Africa, that it's fit for purpose. And that it also has the retirement sector's long-term mandate, on behalf of members and the outcomes that we need at heart, as well as the investable universe. So I think that's critically important. We've recently conducted a market sentiment survey on sustainability reporting in South Africa in collaboration with the CIPC to understand, practices around, current reporting practices, sentiment around the potential adoption and mandatory reporting in South Africa. Very interesting results. When we asked participants, if mandatory reporting were to come in South Africa, who should it apply to? And it was effectively large listed companies, large unlisted companies, bearing in mind that not all companies in our economy, the largest ones, are listed. So there's an unlisted cohort as well, and then large pension funds and the public sector. So it was those that have systemic importance or have some sort of public responsibility, either to members in the case of pension funds and wider society, or to shareholders and wider society in the private sector as well. So quite interesting, I think, results coming out of that. What was also quite interesting is, or surprising, was that the general sentiment was actually quite welcoming of the potential to create some mandatory regulation around these things. And I think that probably speaks to some of the pain points over the last decade or so around how to go about doing these things in a way that's consistent, comparable, etc. I think you only need to work in sustainability to know how complex it is, and work with sustainability data to know that at times it's highly unreliable with gaps, etc. So it takes a huge amount of effort. So yeah, just the general sentiment was fairly positive towards some form of regulation. Also, we asked, should we align with global standards or create our own local standards? I think pretty important questions. The sentiment in general was we need to align with global standards, primarily from a trade perspective, but also from a best practice perspective, but that it does need to be proportional for our context, that we shouldn't be adopting, something that's been adopted in another jurisdiction, as is, without truly contemplating how that's going to work in our context and what outcomes it's trying to drive and how it may be helpful in that.
Well, I really think that this is one of the greatest debates, if I could put it that way, and of our time right now. And not long may it continue, but soon may it be adopted and welcomed and embraced, ultimately, because I think it just stands us all in better stead in our industry, our country, and so on. So from our side, thank you very much for your role that you are playing and taking the message forward and so on. And I do know you have a plane to catch. I'd love to keep on chatting, but I'll have to let you go. But you're welcome at any point in time to utilize our platform. If you want to speak to our audience of the retirement industry on this matter, you are open door to come and have a chat.
Great, thank you very much. And yeah, we'll keep you updated based on the developments that we're picking up and the initiatives that we're driving. So thank you for the opportunity.
Great, thank you. That was Lee Swan from Alexforbes.